The wind that came down off the Rockies that evening carried snow and sorrow in equal measure. It howled through the pines like a ghost that had lost its way home, bending the boughs low, scattering dead needles across the narrow trail. The sun had long dropped behind the jagged peaks, and in its absence the cold crept fast, turning the air brittle and the world silver gray. Martha Langley pressed onward through it, her breath clouding before her body trembling with exhaustion and pain. 52 years old, and every step felt like she was dragging the weight of all those years behind her. Her boots were split, her skirt torn at the hem, and her damned hip ached with each uneven stride. That old injury had never healed right, not since the day she'd been thrown from a mare years back trying to corral a runaway calf. Now it was her constant companion. A cruel reminder that time and hardship made no promises to women who lived too long on the frontier. The mountains loomed above her like giants carved from ice and iron. She had no business being there, not alone. Not this late in the season, but she'd run out of choices. Behind her lay the world that had taken everything she loved. Ahead lay the wilderness, raw and unforgiving, yet somehow freer than the townsfolk who pitied her. Her husband, Sam Langley, had been gone 2 winters now. Typhoid had taken him fast, leaving Martha with little more than a crumbling ranch, debts, and a heart too tired to keep pretending life still held promise. She had tried to hold on. Sold the cattle, sold the horses, even the iron stove he'd built with his own hands. But there's only so long a woman can barter away pieces of her life before she realizes she's already traded her soul. So when the bank came calling, and the men who wore fine coats and city boots told her she had to vacate by the month's end, she didn't argue. She simply packed what little she could carry, a blanket, a rifle that had seen better days, a locket with Sam's picture, and walked. Walked away from the land they'd built together. Walked away from the town that whispered about her behind closed doors. Walked until her legs gave out and the only sound left was the wind moaning across the peaks. By the time she stumbled upon the cabin, night had already swallowed the valley. The structure stood alone in a clearing surrounded by dark pines, a curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. The windows glowed faintly with firelight. For a moment Martha thought it might be a mirage, a trick of her starved mind. She blinked, clutching the strap of her satchel, half expecting it to vanish. But the cabin stayed, solid, real, warm. Her knees nearly buckled from relief. She limped closer, snow crunching beneath her worn soles. The smell of wood smoke reached her nose, carrying the faint promise of stew or coffee. She raised her trembling hand and knocked on the rough-hewn door. Silence answered. Then the sound of boots against a wooden floor. A latch lifted, the hinges creaked, and the door opened to reveal a man. He filled the doorway like a mountain himself, tall, broad-shouldered, his beard streaked with gray, hair long and wild beneath a weathered hat. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, calm yet wary, the kind that had seen too much and judged nothing. He held a rifle loosely in one hand, though he didn't point it at her. They stood in the snow and firelight, 2 strangers measuring each other by instinct alone. "You lost, ma'am?" His voice was deep, rough as gravel, but not unkind. Martha tried to answer, but her lips were too dry. She swallowed, wincing as pain shot through her hip. I need shelter. Just till morning." He looked her over, from her frayed shawl to her trembling hands. There was something in his gaze, not suspicion, but recognition, as if he'd seen her kind of broken before. Finally, he nodded once. "You look like you've been fighting the mountain." He stepped aside, gesturing her in. "Come in before it wins." The warmth hit her like a blessing. Inside, the cabin was simple. Rough plank walls, a stone hearth blazing with pine logs, a table scattered with tools, traps, and a few handmade wooden carvings. A kettle hissed over the fire. The scent of venison stew filled the air. She hesitated near the door, feeling suddenly like she'd stepped into a place too sacred for her sorrow. "Sit," the man said, setting his rifle aside. "You look ready to fall." "I don't wish to be a burden." He gave a faint smile, one corner of his mouth lifting beneath the beard. "Mountain don't care who's a burden. She'll take us all the same if we let her. Now sit." Martha obeyed, lowering herself gingerly onto a wooden chair. The heat from the fire began to thaw her frozen fingers. He ladled stew into a tin bowl and handed it to her without a word. She tried to thank him, but the smell alone nearly undid her. She ate slowly, savoring each bite like it was salvation itself. When she finished, she leaned back, her eyes heavy. "You live up here alone?" He nodded. "Reckon I do. For how long?" He poked at the fire with a stick. "Long enough that I stopped counting winters." His tone made her think better of asking more. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the kind that held weight, a peace forged from years of solitude. Outside, the wind howled through the eaves, rattling the shutters. Inside, the fire popped, casting golden light across his face. Martha studied him quietly. There was something wild about him, yes, but something gentle too, like a bear that had long ago lost the will to hunt. His hands were scarred, his knuckles thick from hard labor, but his eyes, they were kind. The kind that didn't flinch when they looked upon broken things. After a long while, he said, "You can take the cot by the fire. I'll keep watch a while longer." She nodded, too weary to argue. "Thank you, Mr. Boone," he said. "Elias Boone. Martha Langley." He tipped his head slightly as though committing her name to memory. She lay down on the cot, pulling the blanket over her shoulders. For the first time in months, her body began to relax, her pain dulled by warmth and exhaustion. Elias sat near the hearth, his gaze on the flames. Outside, the snow fell thicker, erasing the world beyond the cabin. Before she drifted off, Martha whispered softly, almost to herself, "Didn't think I'd find kindness in a place like this." Elias didn't turn, but his voice carried across the quiet. "Kindness don't choose places, ma'am. Just folks who still remember how to give it." The wind wailed like a mournful spirit through the trees, and in that cabin, hidden deep in the heart of the mountains, two lives that had long been drifting apart from the world found themselves drawn together by nothing more, and nothing less, than survival. When she finally slept, the mountain roared outside, but for the first time in a long while, Martha Langley dreamed of warmth instead of loss. Morning came slow in the high Rockies. Light crept through the frosted panes of Elias Boone's cabin like a shy visitor, touching the rough-hewn timbers and settling over the sleeping woman by the fire. Martha Langley stirred beneath the wool blanket, her breath shallow but steady. The crackle of embers, the scent of wood smoke, and the faint hiss of boiling coffee were the first sounds she'd heard in the new day. Elias had been awake for hours, moving about the cabin with the quiet grace of a man who'd long learned to live with his own company. He'd stoked the fire, chopped wood, checked his snares before dawn. When he came back, he'd found her still sleeping, her face softened by rest, her hair loose across the pillow like strands of silver thread. He'd seen plenty of people stumble into the mountains before, prospectors chasing gold, trappers running from debts, soldiers deserting their posts. But there was something different about this woman, something steady behind the weariness, like a candle still burning after a storm. When she finally woke, blinking against the pale light, he was pouring coffee into a tin cup. "Best drink you'll get this side of the divide," he said, handing it to her. She took it with both hands, wincing at the heat. "Smells like salvation," he grunted, a hint of a smile beneath his beard. "Don't know about salvation. Might just be beans and boiled snow." She sipped, sighed, then sat up slowly, her hips stiff and sore. "You live alone up here?" she asked again, her voice rasped from sleep. "Reckon so," he said, sitting across from her. "Been near 10 years since I seen a town. Don't miss it." 10 years, she whispered, as if testing the words. How does a man live that long with no one to talk to? He looked at the fire for a long moment. "Ain't always been no one." She waited, but he didn't continue, and the silence between them filled with the sounds of the mountains waking, the groan of shifting trees, the distant caw of a raven, the rush of wind across the pass. Elias Boone had come to the Rockies the year after the war ended. He'd seen too much blood in Virginia, too many graves left unmarked. He'd lost his wife and boy to fever before the fighting even stopped. After that, the world below had nothing left to offer him but noise and ghosts. So he traded it all for quiet, moved where only the wolves remembered his name. He didn't tell her that yet, but the weight of it hung in his every motion. Over the next few days, Martha recovered. Her strength returned slowly, though the limp stayed. She tried to help around the cabin, cleaned dishes, mended torn shirts, swept out corners where dust had settled deep. Elias didn't stop her. He simply watched with a quiet respect, knowing what it meant for a proud soul to find purpose again. He spoke little, and when he did, His voice was like gravel under snow, rough, honest, deliberate. Yet Martha found comfort in it. After years of townsfolk talking around her, pitying her, ignoring her, selling her memories 1 acre at a time, it was something to be spoken to, plain and direct. At night, they'd sit by the fire. Elias would whittle small shapes from pine, birds, deer, a child's toy horse, and set them along the mantel. Martha watched his hands steady despite their scars. "You've got a craftsman's touch," she said once. He shrugged. "Learned it making traps. Guess even a trap's gotta look right if you're gonna stare at it all winter." "Seems to me," she said softly, "a man carves things to remember what it feels like to create, not just survive." He looked at her then, really looked, and something in his gaze softened. "Maybe," he said. On the 4th evening, she told him her story. The fire had burned low, throwing red shadows across the floor. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines. She spoke of the ranch, how she and Sam Langley had built it from nothing but grit and hope, how the drought came, how the sickness took him, and how the debts came crawling after like wolves. She didn't cry. The tears had dried long ago, replaced by a quiet ache that lived deep in her bones. When she finished, Elias sat back, his jaw tight. "I'm 52, she said finally, staring into the coals. "My body's broken, my hip don't work right. My hands shake when the cold sets in. I came up here 'cause there's nothing left down there worth breathing for." For a long while, he said nothing. The fire popped. The wind carried snow against the window panes. Then he spoke low and sure. "Ain't no shame in being tired, Martha. World takes pieces from all of us. Some just got less left to give." She nodded slowly, her throat tight. "Then what's a woman supposed to do when there's no fight left?" Elias turned toward her, his eyes catching the firelight. "Then you let someone else fight for you a while." She blinked, startled by the warmth in his words. "You'd fight for me? You don't even know me. Don't need to. You're standing in front of me, and that's reason enough." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something unspoken, something new. Martha felt it like a spark deep inside her chest, small but alive. Over the next week, a rhythm settled between them. She cooked simple meals. He hunted and hauled wood. He built her a cane from an elk's antler, carved smooth and fitted to her height. When she took her first steps outside with it, the snow crisp underfoot, she felt almost whole again. "You make a fine doctor," she said. He chuckled. "Doctor'd charge you more than a pot of stew." The laugh that escaped her surprised them both. It was rusty from disuse, but it filled the air, warm and bright. Elias looked at her as though that sound alone had healed something in him. That night after supper, she found herself humming by the fire. A tune she'd learned as a girl back in Missouri. Elias listened, his knife stilling over the wood in his hand. When she stopped, embarrassed, he said, "Keep on. Cabin ain't heard music in a long time." And so she did. Each passing day, the mountain's harshness softened, not because it grew easier, but because they bore it together. Once, when a storm came roaring through, they sat up all night by the fire, listening to the wind claw at the shutters. Martha shivered, remembering too many nights alone, too many losses. Elias placed a blanket around her shoulders and said, "You're safe here. The mountain don't take what she's already given back." "What's she given back?" He met her eyes. "You." She turned away quickly, blinking tears she didn't want him to see. For a woman who thought she'd used up all her heart had to give, it startled her how alive it still felt when he spoke that way. When dawn came, the storm broke, leaving the world quiet and white. Elias stepped outside to shovel the snow from the roof, his breath misting in the cold air. Martha watched him through the window. How strong he moved, how his shoulders bore the weight of a world he'd chosen to carry alone. And something inside her whispered, maybe not anymore. For the first time in years, Martha Langley didn't feel like she was waiting for death. She felt like she'd stumbled into something worth living for again. A man made of stone and silence, who'd found her broken on the trail and offered not pity but promise. When he came back in, stamping snow from his boots, she looked up and smiled. "Elias, yeah? If the mountain's keeping me, then I reckon I'll try not to disappoint her." He grinned, rare and soft. "That's the spirit." And that night, as the fire burned low and the stars shone hard through the frosted glass, two souls, each carrying ghosts of their own, found a strange, quiet peace together in the heart of a mountain that had nearly killed them both. The winter came down hard that year, harder than any Elias Boone could remember. Snow buried the pines up to their shoulders and sealed the world in silence. For weeks the mountain was nothing but white and shadow. The wind screamed across the ridges, and even the wolves stayed quiet. But inside the small cabin tucked between the frozen slopes, there was warmth, real warmth, the kind that didn't come from fire alone. Elias and Martha had settled into a rhythm as natural as breathing. At dawn, he'd break through the ice on the creek to fetch water. By the time he returned, she'd have coffee ready, thick and black as tar, served in those same battered tin cups that had outlasted everything else he owned. She'd learned to move carefully with her cane, her limp still stubborn, but her spirit mending faster than her bones. She insisted on helping no matter how much he told her to rest. He'd come in from the cold with his arms full of logs and find her stirring stew or mending his shirts by the fire, humming some old hymn she half remembered from her childhood. "Woman like you don't belong in a mountain storm," he told her one morning. Laying down the wood with a thud, she smiled faintly, tying her gray hair back with a strip of cloth. "Woman like me don't belong anywhere else no more." Elias didn't argue. He knew the truth in her words. That winter was cruel, but it was also kind in its own way. It forced them together, bound by need and survival. When the snow came howling at their door, they'd sit by the fire and talk. At first about simple things, weather, food, the traps. But as the night stretched long, the talk turned softer, deeper. He told her about his wife, Clara, and their little boy, Nathan, who'd both died of fever one spring when the rivers flooded and the doctor couldn't get through. His voice cracked when he said the boy's name. Martha reached across the table and took his rough hand in hers, saying nothing, because words weren't needed for grief that deep. In time, she shared her own ghosts, her Sam, their lost ranch, the years she spent praying for the strength to keep living when she no longer wanted to. They didn't trade pity. They traded understanding. After that night, something in the cabin changed. They began to laugh more. He teased her about her coffee, strong enough to peel paint, he'd say, and she'd swat at him with her spoon. Once, she caught him whittling something small by the fire and tried to peek, but he covered it quickly, embarrassed. "What are you hiding, Boone?" "Just keeping my hands busy," he said gruffly, though his ears reddened under his beard. Later, she found it sitting on the mantel, a small wooden heart carved from pine, smooth and simple. Her breath caught when she saw it, and though he never said it was for her, she never asked because she already knew. One morning, the storm had raged all night, burying the cabin in silence so deep it felt holy. Elias went to check the traps, his figure vanishing into the white. Martha watched from the window, her heart tight. Each time he left, she felt that same fear claw at her, that the mountain would keep him, that she'd lose one more soul to its cold indifference. She busied herself baking biscuits, humming to drown out the wind. But when the door finally creaked open and Elias stepped in, dusted with snow and carrying 2 rabbits, she felt relief flood her chest so sharp it almost hurt. "Miss me that much?" he teased, setting down his rifle. She pretended to scowl. "Only worried you'd bring back frostbite instead of supper." He chuckled, shaking off the cold. "You'd scold the Almighty himself, wouldn't you?" "If he tracked snow in my clean floor? Yes." That laughter warmed the cabin more than the fire ever could. But the mountain wasn't done testing them. One evening, Martha tried to fetch wood from the porch. Her hip had been aching for days, but she hated feeling helpless. She braced herself, took 2 careful steps outside, and the pain hit so sudden and sharp she lost her balance. The world tilted and she went down hard into the snow, gasping as white pain shot through her leg. Inside, Elias heard the thud and the muffled cry. He was through the door in seconds, coat half on, snow swirling around him. He found her trying to sit up, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Elias," she started, voice shaking. "I'm sorry. He knelt beside her, scooping her up as if she weighed nothing. "Hush now." His voice was soft but fierce. "Ain't a thing to be sorry for." Her hands clutched his coat as he carried her back inside. She could feel the strength in him, the steady heartbeat against her cheek. When he laid her down near the fire, she turned her face away, ashamed. "I told you," she whispered. "My body's broken. I can't—" He cut her off gently, kneeling so their eyes met. His hand brushed the hair from her forehead. "Then I'll carry you forever." The words hung between them, heavy as a vow. Something broke inside her then. Not her hip, not her pride, but that cold wall she'd built around her heart. She tried to speak, but the tears came instead, hot and helpless. Elias just held her hand, his thumb tracing the rough lines of her palm until her sobs softened to quiet breaths. That night, he stayed beside her while she slept, the firelight painting gold across her face. He hadn't meant to say those words, but they'd come from somewhere deep, a truth he couldn't hide anymore. Days passed, and her legs slowly mended. She could walk again with the cane, though he still hovered close, ready to catch her if she faltered. The snow eased for a spell, and the mountains seemed to give them peace. In the evenings, he'd read aloud from an old Bible, his voice steady and low. Sometimes she'd fall asleep to the sound, and he'd watch her, feeling something stir inside him that he thought had died long ago. Once she woke to find him half asleep in the chair beside her. "You're watching over me like a shepherd," she murmured. "Just making sure the flock don't wander," he replied, smiling faintly. Her lips curved. "Then maybe I'll stay near the fire a while longer." "Reckon I'd like that." Outside, the blizzards kept coming, but the storm within them had quieted. They'd both been broken once, by loss, by loneliness. But now they were learning the slow, stubborn art of healing. One evening, as the snow melted on the window panes and the sky turned lavender, Martha whispered, "You ever think the Lord gives second chances to folks like us?" Elias poked the fire thoughtfully. "I reckon he gives them to anyone who lives long enough to need one." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "Then I suppose this is ours." He looked at her then, and in that look was everything they didn't say. The gratitude, the longing, the quiet promise that what they had found in the heart of that wild, frozen land was more than survival. It was grace, and as the storm raged once more outside, Elias Boone reached across the small space between them and took Martha Langley's hand, holding it firm as if by doing so he could keep the mountain, the world, and time itself from taking her away. By March, the snows began to melt. At first, it was only the faintest sound, a trickle under the eaves, a soft sigh in the pines. Then one morning, the world outside the cabin was alive with the drip and sparkle of thaw. The ice broke loose from the creek and sang its way downhill, carrying the winter away piece by piece. For the first time in months, Martha Langley stood on the porch without shivering. She leaned on her cane, breathing in the clean, sharp scent of pine and wet earth. The sun had climbed higher than she'd seen it all season, warm enough to make her close her eyes and smile. Behind her, Elias Boone came out carrying 2 mugs of coffee. Steam rose from them, curling into the morning air. He handed one to her, then leaned against the porch rail beside her. "Mountain's waking up," he said. Martha nodded, eyes on the valley below. Patches of green broke through the snow like the first shy promises of life. Birds darted between branches, their calls echoing clear and sweet. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I'd near forgotten what spring smells like." Elias smiled beneath his beard. "She don't forget folks who respect her. Just makes 'em wait long enough to prove they're worth rememberin'." They drank their coffee in silence, both content just to stand there together. 2 old souls reborn alongside the mountain. When the snow receded from the clearing, Elias began working the earth. He turned the soil behind the cabin with a spade, his shoulders rolling under the weight, his breath coming in steady clouds. Martha watched from her chair, admiring how time had weathered him without breaking him. "What are you doing, Boone?" she called. He didn't look up. "What's it look like?" "Gonna make you a garden." "A garden?" she repeated, laughing softly.
"Ain't no woman ever needed flowers to live up here." "Not flowers," he said, jabbing the spade into the soil again.
"Potatoes, beans, maybe herbs if you're feeling fancy." She smiled, the sound of his gruff voice a comfort she'd grown to crave. "You think I'm gonna live long enough to see beans grow in this rock?" He paused, glancing back at her. "Reckon I plan on making sure you do." And so they planted together. She sat on a low stool while he worked the rows, handing him seeds and laughing whenever he tried to claim he knew more about planting than she did. She'd spent years tending ranch gardens back home, beans, corn, squash, and the memory of it stirred something sweet inside her. By mid-afternoon, her hands were dirty, her cheeks flushed with color. She hadn't felt that kind of tired in years, the good kind, the kind that comes from purpose, not sorrow. As the days grew longer, they began to live by the rhythm of the thaw. Elias would rise early to hunt or fish. Martha would cook breakfast, then tend the little garden, humming as she worked. She made curtains for the windows from an old blanket, mended his shirts, even scrubbed the floor till the pine shone. Sometimes he'd pause from his work just to watch her move about the cabin. Her silver hair tied back, her steps slow but sure. Once, when she caught him staring, she said, "What are you looking at, Boone?" He smiled, rough and shy all at once. "Nothing. Just a miracle, I guess." She rolled her eyes, though her heart fluttered like a girl's. Miracle's a strong word for a worn-out widow. He met her gaze then, steady and sure. "Ain't the kind of miracle that fades, Martha. It's the kind that stays when the world quits caring." She turned away, flustered, pretending to fuss with her apron. But his words stuck to her like the scent of pine after rain. By late spring, the mountains had turned lush and green. Wildflowers painted the meadows, and the creek ran clear again. But with the change came something neither of them expected. One morning, Martha woke with a fever. It started small, a tremble in her hands, a heat behind her eyes. But by nightfall, she was shivering under blankets, her skin clammy and pale. Elias stayed by her side, his worry etched deep into his face. He cooled her brow with wet cloths, made broth she was too weak to drink, and whispered to her through the long nights. "You rest easy now," he murmured, voice thick with fear. "You just hold on here?" For 3 days and nights he barely slept. He sat beside her, clutching her hand like a man anchoring himself to shore. The fever burned hot, and sometimes she rambled in her sleep, calling out names: Sam, her husband, her mother, and once, softly, Elias. That one nearly broke him. By the 4th morning, the fever broke. She woke weak but alive, her skin cool at last. The first thing she saw was him, slumped in the chair beside her, head bowed, still holding her hand even in sleep. His beard had grown thicker, his eyes shadowed from exhaustion. "Elias," she whispered. He stirred, blinking awake. When he saw her eyes open, a laugh broke out of him, hoarse, raw, half a sob. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, voice shaking. "You scared the hell out of me, woman." She smiled faintly. "I was ready to die, you know. Didn't think there was any fight left." He brushed the hair from her cheek with a tenderness that startled her. "Reckon you'll have to wait. I still got seeds to show you how to plant." She laughed weakly, and the sound filled the cabin like sunlight. After that, she recovered fast. The fever left her thinner, slower, but alive and grateful. Elias watched her every step, always close enough to steady her if she stumbled. When she scolded him for hovering, he only said, "Ain't hovering. Just staying where my heart tells me to." One evening, when she was strong enough to walk to the porch again, the two of them sat watching the sun drop behind the peaks. The sky burned gold and crimson, the air warm and sweet. "Funny thing," she said softly. "I thought I came here to die." Elias turned toward her. "And what do you think now?" She smiled, eyes glistening. "Now I think maybe the good Lord sent me up this mountain to live again." He reached over, took her hand in his. "Ain't a maybe about it, Martha. Some folks find salvation in church pews. Others find it in quiet company and a warm fire." She looked at him, her heart swelling. "And what about you, Elias Boone? Where'd you find yours?" He paused, staring out across the valley. "Reckon she knocked on my door one snowing night and near froze to death on my porch." Her breath caught, and for a moment neither spoke. The wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere far off, a hawk cried into the fading light. That night, when the stars came out and the moon silvered the peaks, Martha lay awake listening to Elias breathe beside the fire. She realized she wasn't afraid anymore, not of death, not of loneliness, not of time. She'd found something rare up there in the mountains. Not just a man, but peace. And peace, she thought, might just be the truest kind of love. Years slipped away in quiet grace upon that mountain. The world below changed. Railroads stretched farther, towns rose and fell. But up here, time moved slower. The snows came and went. The river froze and thawed. The pines whispered their same old songs. And through it all, Elias Boone and Martha Langley lived out their days in that small, steadfast cabin where winter once nearly claimed her. By the second spring, the garden grew thick with green, beans curling around stakes, potatoes sprouting in neat mounds, wildflowers blooming where she'd once fallen. Martha no longer spoke of death or loss. She rose each morning to the smell of coffee and the sound of Elias chopping wood, his axe steady and sure. When her hip pained her too much, he'd lift her onto the porch chair he'd built, broad, smooth, strong as his arms. "You just sit there and boss me around," he'd tease, and she'd laugh. tapping her cane against the porch rail like a queen with her scepter. They became known to the few travelers who passed through the valley. Trappers, drifters, and prospectors sometimes stopped for a night, drawn by the smoke curling from the chimney or the smell of stew in the air. Elias was always kind but cautious, and Martha treated each guest with that warm, steady hospitality only a woman who'd known loneliness could give. Boone's angel, one traveler called her once, tipping his hat as he left. Elias grunted at that, but later, when he thought she was asleep, she heard him whisper under his breath, "Ain't wrong, though." One autumn afternoon, the aspens blazed gold across the mountainside. Martha sat on the porch wrapped in a shawl, knitting by the fire Elias had built outside. The air was crisp, the light soft, and the smell of wood smoke mixed with pine and memory. Elias came up behind her carrying a small box he'd carved from oak. He handed it to her silently. She opened it and found, nestled inside, a delicate necklace made of polished river stones and one smooth piece of heart-shaped wood, the same pine he'd carved all those winters ago. Her eyes glistened as she touched it. "You kept it all this time?" He nodded. "Reckon it was waitin' for the right day." She smiled through tears. "Elias Boone, you're a better man than I ever thought I'd find on this side of heaven." He chuckled low. "Ain't that hard when the competition's all gone?" "Don't you joke about that," she said softly, then reached out, took his calloused hand, and kissed it. That evening they sat watching the sun sink behind the peaks, the sky turning from gold to violet. For a long while they said nothing. The silence between them was deep and full, the kind that only two people who've shared both suffering and salvation can understand. Martha spoke first. "You ever wonder if the world remembers folks like us? The ones who live quiet, far from all the noise?" Elias looked out across the valley, his profile outlined by the dying light. "Reckon it don't matter if it does. The mountain remembers. The wind, the trees, they keep our stories long after the rest forget." She smiled faintly. "Then I suppose I'll trust the mountain with mine." Winter came once more, gentle at first. The snow fell soft, blanketing the cabin and the garden they'd tended together. Martha's hands trembled more these days. Her hair, once streaked with silver, was now white as the peaks above, but her eyes still sparkled and her laughter still came easily whenever Elias tried to hide his worry behind gruff words. "You keep fussin' like an old hen," she'd say, and he'd grunt. "If I didn't fuss, you'd freeze solid by sundown." But one morning, when he came in with an armful of kindling, she didn't answer his greeting. She sat by the fire, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, her breath shallow. He set the wood down, his chest tightening. "Martha?" She turned her head slowly, smiling at him, soft, tired, peaceful. "You kept your promise, mountain man." His throat closed. "What promise is that?" "You said you'd carry me forever." Her fingers reached for his hand, cold but gentle. "And you did." Tears welled behind his eyes. "Ain't done yet, Martha." "Don't talk like that," but she only smiled again. "Then I'll be waitin'. Elias. Just not here." She drew one final breath, and with it, the smallest sigh, as if she'd finally set down the burden of all those hard, wandering years. He sat with her long into the night, his rough hand clasped around hers, the firelight flickering across her still face. Outside, the snow fell soft and steady, wrapping the world in silence. In the morning, Elias buried her beneath the tall pines overlooking the creek. The ground was frozen, but he worked through the cold without rest, his breath fogging the air, his body aching. When it was done, he carved her name into a stone with his own hands. Martha Langley Boone, carried forever. He set her locket beside her and the wooden heart in her folded hands. Then he stood for a long time, his hat pressed against his chest, whispering prayers that only the mountain heard. After that, he wasn't quite the same. He still chopped wood, still tended the fire, still mended traps and walked the ridges. But his eyes looked farther now, toward horizons she could no longer see. Each morning at dawn, he carried her shawl out to the porch, wrapped it around himself, and sat watching the sunrise. He'd talk aloud to her as if she were right there beside him, telling her about the fox tracks he'd found, the way the snow glistened, how the beans had sprouted early in spring. Sometimes he'd laugh, other times he'd just fall quiet, his words turning to breath that vanished into the cold. One late winter, when the snows began to melt again, a passing trapper came through the valley and found the cabin empty. The door stood open, The fire burned low, and inside, on the table, lay a simple note written in a rough hand. Gone to carry her once more. They say he went up the ridge that night, following the same trail where Martha had first stumbled through the snow years before. Some claim they found his tracks leading toward her grave and then disappearing into the pines. Others swear that when the dawn breaks on quiet mornings, you can still see a lone figure standing by that grave, a tall man with gray in his beard, holding something small against his chest. And if you listen close, you might hear a whisper on the wind, soft as a prayer. Then I'll carry you forever. The cabin still stands, they say, half covered by moss and thyme. The garden's gone wild, and the porch chair rocks gently in the wind as though waiting for someone to return. But when the sun hits the valley just right, the creek still sings and the mountain still remembers the love it once sheltered, the broken woman who found her strength again, and the mountain man who carried her not just through the snow but through forever.